So today, Donald Trump is set to meet with Vladimir Putin in Alaska to discuss a roadmap to a possible peace in Ukraine. Now, a lot of things have been said about this conflict. I've said many things about it in other videos, but I wanted to dedicate this video to how peace can actually be made there, what Trump would have to do, and what concessions he would have to give up to make that peace. And those things are pretty simple. I think they go back to the start, but first I want to talk about the territorial swap idea that's come up. So right now, Russia occupies something like 85% of the Donbass and 4 Donbass oblasts: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Now there's this idea bouncing around that there could be a territory swap by which Putin agrees to less territory than he currently occupies, but territory that's more preferable for the Ukrainians to give up. Now Zelensky has already pushed back about this. He said, our constitution recognizes these regions and we will not give up a single acre, essentially. That's been reported in the media. And then I've heard from people on the Russian side that say, hey, these oblasts are written into the Russian constitution now, so we can't give them up legally either. Well, if the consideration is territorial exchange, that will have to happen to some extent. But actually, I don't think it's territory that's at the heart of this thing. It never has been. Actually, if you look back historically about what Putin's demands have been, his desires for getting out of this thing with peace, and he has been consistent on offering peace, not only in Istanbul, but also through a draft treaty to NATO on the eve of his invasion in 2022, you'll see what Russia actually wants. So this is not conjecture on my part. This has actually been a constant series of declarations laying out exactly what Russia wants. It's no mystery. The mainstream media has tried to make it a mystery, but it isn't. It's the dedicated view and declaration that Ukraine won't be part of NATO. That's the most important thing, because NATO has flirted with including Ukraine. They haven't voted on it, and I don't think they would vote on it during wartime. It would invoke Article 5 and the introduction of a hot war versus a nuclear power, because right now we only have a proxy war with a nuclear power, and oh, that's so much better, right? Well, it doesn't benefit the U.S. to be part of this, but that is the key Russian ask here. And there's other Russian asks, and I'm not saying territory doesn't play into it whatsoever. Obviously, recognizing that Crimea is part of Russia too is part of that. And we have the 2014 referendum from Crimea saying by a margin of 97% that they want to be part of Russia, by the way. But in regard to NATO, so Putin drew up a draft treaty he sent to NATO in December of 2021. It was received by Jens Stoltenberg, the General Secretary of NATO. He looked at the list of, requirements and asked, it was no Ukraine in NATO. That's something that constant U.S. administrations, including Bush at the Bucharest summit, Obama, and others have called for and flirted with openly. That was the key one. Well, he looked at that and said, Putin sent us this draft treaty, and he said if we just put it in writing that Ukraine wouldn't be part of NATO and a few other conditions, he wouldn't invade. But instead of that, he got war. He got exactly what he didn't want. This was a mass down moment for the UN General Secretary, and you can see this video online. Just search for Jens Stoltenberg on Putin. You can see that all over the place. It's been posted on Twitter and other places. Other things that he asked is Crimean recognition as being part of Russia and political autonomy for Donetsk and Luhansk. Those are 2 of the oblasts that were supposed to have political autonomy under the Minsk II agreements. Minsk I and Minsk II were 2 agreements, one of which was solidified in 2014 and one was solidified in 2015, that were supposed to bring political autonomy to this Russian-speaking, culturally Russian part of Ukraine. Those are the oblasts in the east, including Luhansk and Donetsk. Ukraine would not do that, and the U.S. did not kind of push Ukraine to doing that, and you had people like Angela Merkel in the EU saying, yeah, that was always a ruse. We were never going to, lay the groundwork for political autonomy for those regions, even though both sides, including Russia and the United States, had agreed to those kind of terms. Well, what you had after Putin invaded in the 7th year of a civil war was several months or weeks after that, the groundwork for another peace that Putin offered in Istanbul to Zelensky. And Word had it that Zelensky was on the cusp of signing this peace agreement. There were reports of, the champagne bottles being prepared to be uncorked for a new era of peace with some concessions from Ukraine. Well, if you followed this, you know what happened after that. Boris Johnson from the UK flew down there to talk him out of this, to say, Zelensky, the US is going to be on your side, EU and NATO are going to be on your side, you can fight the Russians, you can get into this battle. That's why John Mearsheimer has long said that the US and NATO led Ukraine down the primrose path. And what that is it's a path that looks like it's filled with flowers, but in the end, it's doom and gloom and death and murder, and that's what's come from this war. It's been over 1 million deaths by many estimates, where you have martial law imposed, conscription mandates expanded to include old men who are plucked off the streets in Ukraine to fight against a perilous battle through which very little territorial changes have occurred over the last 3.5 years. The last time Ukraine made a major push was in the summer of 2024, and that's been reversed. It was reversed by early 2025, and very little headway has been made since, and that's the case regardless of all the things Trump has talked about remaining firm against Putin and repeating the CNN and Biden era propaganda about how, Russia just wanted all of Ukraine and that's why they're there. And he's tried to bring up, hey, we're going to have secondary tariffs on all these countries trading with Russia. And none of that has had any effect on the actual battlefield conditions, the battlefield state, where Russia, again, occupies something like 85% of these Donbass oblasts. And that's what we have now. So no amount of sanctions under the sun is going to change that. No amount of secondary tariffs will change that. That will only inflame tensions with some of the BRICS countries that the U.S. actually, in its own interest, would want to maintain a good relationship with. The key one I'm thinking about is India. Modi and Trump have a very familiar and friendly background, especially from Trump's first term, and by doing that would inflame tensions on the most pro-Western BRICS country, now in the China and Russia BRICS alliance, but could be potentially peeled off because they are close friends, Modi and Trump, and their interests are tied in many ways economically in ways that Russia and China aren't. So I believe that it is the condition of declaring, being so straightforward about the fact that Ukraine will not be part of NATO that Trump isn't willing to accept yet. And until he takes that step, I don't think there will be any potential for peace, regardless of how much territory gets swapped. Even if Ukraine was to somehow get back all of the Donbass that they've lost, with what Russia isn't going to do, by the way, it wouldn't matter if they still flirted with the idea of Ukraine being in NATO, because that's Putin's top ask. Now, there are other asks, too. He wants the dismantlement of NATO forces in the Eastern European bloc, and Ukraine in particular. He wants those resources, intelligence, and boots on the ground to be taken out of NATO. And again, I think that's a reasonable ask. The U.S. would have that same ask if the Russians put troops on the border of Mexico, flirted with Mexico being in their military alliance, and by the way, putting offensive weaponry essentially all the way up to the border. We know how that would be treated in the U.S. because the U.S. responded to a similar situation like that in 1963. It was called the Cuban Missile Crisis, or 62, I forgot. Either way, that's a case in which the U.S. responded in kind. They viewed that as a threat. This is no different when it comes to Russia. So again, if Trump wants peace, he has to acknowledge the demilitarization of Ukraine, no Ukraine in NATO, he has to state it firmly, and denazification. That's another ask of Putin that doesn't get covered much in the United States because we're supposed to view these neo-Nazi paramilitary groups and regiments within the Ukrainian army as if they're just some kind of isolated moderate Nazi groups. But no, Azov Battalion is a hardcore ideological group of Nazis that are fighting against the Ukrainians or the Russians, and there's more groups than that in Ukraine as well that have these kind of leanings. And one of Putin's desires is to ensure a denazification process by which that influence doesn't remain and take hold politically or militarily as it's manifesting now in this war. You had all these stories that Western media printed up about how Ukraine has gone Nazi, parts of their military have gone Nazi toward Azov and other places before 2022, but mysteriously all of those stories just vanished the moment we were supposed to support democracy by siding with Ukraine at all costs. And this is all during the time in which America first is the leading mantra of this administration. But it's hardly been that. It's been Ukraine first, Israel first too, but Ukraine first in terms of this theater. And after $200 billion dumped into this thing, there's no headway being made by Ukraine. There's all sorts of propaganda to try to convince us of that, especially in the early years of this conflict, but it isn't panning out now. Remember all those stories about how Ukraine was winning the fight, they were making headway, pushing into Russia, and Russia was running out of ammunition, and they're on the cusp of winning this thing, whatever winning was. They never set out the win conditions because it was never going to be regime change, that's for sure. But you don't even hear that propaganda anymore. And you had mass-scale protests in Kyiv, really for the first time a few weeks ago, because Zelensky has done such an immaculate job of cracking down in an authoritarian way against his own resistance to his government within his government, that he's outlawed rival political parties, shut down adversarial media agents, and even closed Eastern Orthodox churches. He just called them Russian churches, so apparently you have no religious worship rights if they're not what you want. And that's the course of Ukraine, and that's the guy that's supposed to be standing up for democracy for the United States. So again, if Trump wants peace, you have to acknowledge the base level demands. Not any territorial swaps under the sun can do that. That is no Ukraine and NATO, demilitarization, taking out all the NATO resources, and denazification. Territorial swaps are a drop in the bucket in consideration of kind of what is really at the heart of this thing. And if Zelensky doesn't agree to territorial changes at all, that could be fine. Trump could draw a line there if he really wanted to and said, hey, if you don't agree to any territorial changes for a potential peace, if that is a consideration, and again, I think that's a more minor consideration in the grand scheme of things, if you won't budge on that at all, Zelensky, we're just hightailing it out of here. We're cutting aid completely, being serious about that, and then I think that would cause Zelensky to have second thoughts about no territorial exchange, regardless of what the Constitution says. He doesn't care about what the Ukrainian Constitution says anyways, because of how he's cracked down on civil liberties, expanded martial law, etc., in many ways contrary to what it allows. So that's where we're at. The U.S. has a real opportunity here to disengage. Do I think they will? No, I don't think they will, and I don't think Trump is willing to give up what it would take to do that. And the reason why, despite his good rhetoric about how he wanted people to stop dying, it doesn't matter because the lobbies still remain. The military-industrial complex is still there. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing still want their cut of this whole thing, and it's incentivized from their perspective to keep this war going, to make it long and drawn out. 20-plus years if they can, like Afghanistan and Iraq was. Because it's what the great Julian Assange always said, is they don't want a successful war, they want an endless war, and that's to keep the money flowing into the pockets of the military-industrial complex, taking it from the pockets of Americans that actually want an American-first foreign policy. So that's where we're at. That's what I think. Let me know in the comments below. Do you agree with me? What will it take to secure peace in Ukraine? Let me know down below. Do you think a peace or ceasefire will result from this conference with Putin? I'd also like to hear from you on that. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support the channel, and in return, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.